Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Alright guys, how's it going? I'm Danny Colville, if we haven't met before. I'm the owner of Colville Outfitters and Custom Tackle in Hamburg, New York. I also make reels called Colville Precision Reels. So I wanted to just kind of go over a bunch of stuff with you guys, but one of the things that is the most challenging about centerpin fishing is the casting, so I was going to start there, and then hopefully you guys can think of some questions and then ask them after I work on some casting. So I wanted to go over that first with you. So there's like several different casts that centerpin fishermen use, and the most basic one is called a side cast. The best one to learn is the Wallace cast, and there's a few different formats of the Wallace cast, and then there's also the BC swing cast. So depending on what circumstance you're in, that's when you decide to use which cast of your choice in that situation. So the cast that I use 90% of the time is called a crossbody Wallace cast, and that's where I come across my body this way, and I'm going to load up my reel, pull down on the line, and just let the float kind of lead the way forward. So I'll start off with that one. All right, so the kind of the key factor with this cast is you have to make sure that you have enough room from the or enough line from the top of your rod all the way down to your float, and I refer to this as a pendulum. So that pendulum is what's going to be able to load your rod for you and be able to load the reel so you can cast the line. So this is a heavier float setup, so this one's going to be easier to cast. This is an 11-gram loafer shaped float. So I'll do that casting first. This is a rig setup for the Niagara River, since that's where I'm headed tomorrow. And I just spooled it up with some brand new 15-pound line. So the line's I'm gonna have to cast it a couple times before it starts getting out there good, just so it doesn't bed on me first. So I'll start off with that cast. I'm gonna have to should have rigged up an 11.5 footer. So the crossbody Wallace cast, you always use your stopper finger, which is my ring finger. Some guys like to use their pinky, some guys like to use their middle finger, but what's most comfortable for me is my ring finger, because I like to take my pointer finger and put it up on the foregrip of the rod so I have extra support there when I'm holding it up. Alright, so once I have my pendulum, which I would say is about anywhere from 7 to 8 foot away from the tip of my rod, I'm going to grab the line with 2 fingers down like so, and I'm going to stay right at the bottom of the reel the whole time, and I'm going to let the line roll through my fingers like a guide going out through the first guide on the rod. Okay, so I got my pendulum here. Once I got my pendulum, I'm going to come back, and then once I'm back here, this is where I release my finger, and then it will start spinning a little bit slowly, and then I come forward, and I pull the... Told you that was going to happen with this new line. Give me one second. Alright, so again, I'm back here, and then I come forward. I'm going to take my 2 fingers and stay at the bottom of the reel, and I'm going to pull down and come forward like so. And there's a couple different ways to retrieve a center pin. You know, you can obviously use your handles like so. If the reel has finger holes, you could stick your finger in a reel with the finger holes, or my favorite way to retrieve is to bat the reel in like this. When you're looking at buying a center pin reel, you definitely want to try to look for something that has more of a rounded rim with more surface area, so this way you're able to get the best possible pickup. So I'll do that cast again for you guys. Alright, so I'm coming across my body this way, and I'm going to take my 2 fingers, go at the bottom of the reel, keep my stopper finger, which is my ring finger here, and then I'm going to come back. As I come back, and right before I'm about to come forward, I take my ring finger, my stopper finger off the spool, and I come forward and I pitch it out there. And then as you notice too, I'm slowing it down the whole time so I don't get any backlashes. And by slowing down the line as you cast, you're also allowing all your split shot to lay in a nice even line straight out, where you're not having the line wrap around the top of the float. If you just casted it out there and it all was just one big ball going out, you typically will have a lot of line that wraps around the top of your float. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my other rod really quick. So it's slightly shorter.
That's 11.6 there too, that other one.
Okay. Okay, and this is more of a standard size rig. This is a 7-gram float. This is what I would use at like some of the medium to larger size creeks, Oak Orchard, the Salmon River, the Cattaraugus. That would pretty much be the ideal size for that. Okay, and then again, I'll just show you guys this cast again. I'm taking 2 fingers and I'm going down at the bottom of the reel. When I'm teaching this cast to guys, sometimes I tell them to keep their fingers and kind of hold it at the bottom of the reel. Then they're not worried about the stopper finger as much. Although the stopper finger is nice because then you could feather the spool as it's spinning when you're casting out. So that's kind of important. But if it's too much for you to pay attention to, just make sure that you grab the line with 2 fingers, you go at the bottom of the reel, and you just come back and go forward and cast. All right, so that's one cast there. Now the next cast I'll show you guys, this is probably the most basic cast. This is called a side cast, and it is really easy to learn how to do. It's what a lot of guys do today, and you get a lot of distance. The only difference between this cast and the cast where you're actually spinning the reel is it's coming off the side of the spool just like a spinning reel does, so you are going to get a little bit of line twist. You also have to use the rod more because you're not pulling the line down on the reel, which is getting the reel spinning, which is then pushing your rig out there. So this one, you can pretty much reel. You don't need to worry about the pendulum as much. You could reel it up all the way to the top. I like this cast if I'm fishing a fixed float and I have a really long leader. So if I'm fishing, let's say, a 15-foot lead from the tip of my float all the way down to my presentation, I'm going to want to use a side cast because when you're using any sort of Wallace cast, you have to pull down on the float, which when you pull down, it brings it up like this closer to the tip. So the side cast is nice if you're fishing a really long leader and you don't have the room to be able to pull down on the line to get it going. So a side cast is pretty simple. You just want to stay parallel to your reel the whole time, and you just want to pinch your line, with 2 fingers, and then you want to create, as the line's going, you just want to create like a claw or like a cup so the line can go out. So a side cast, you just stay even, and that's your side cast. And then again, you could see the amount of line twist that I got just from doing that from one single cast. So if you need to use it, there's certain situations that you do need to use it. Like I said, if you're fishing a really long lead, or if there's something to the side of you, or if there's something up above you, this cast is nice because you can keep your rod all in this range from here and here. So if I have something that's too high up top from me and I can't raise my rod up, or if I'm, again, if I'm too close to the tip, because I'm running such a long leader, that's a good cast. So again, I'll show you that one more time. And again, you're just basically, it's just another guide that's coming out. So the guide's to the side instead of underneath the reel. And that's really easy to learn. All you have to do is just train your hand to just to stay parallel with the reel the whole time. Just stay to the side of it. What I see a lot of people, what they do is when they're learning, they always want to move their hand right away. It's like kind of you got to build up your muscle memory to make sure when you cast, you keep your hand either below the reel or to the side of the reel the whole time. Because I see a lot of guys, they want to do this, they want to grab it and then they'll let go. And then if you let go of the line and you don't keep that guide there, it'll just stop short. So another cast too, this is kind of a version of the Wallace cast where if you can't come behind you, or let's say you're in a crowded spot where there's a lot of guys, what I like to do is I like to make my pendulum longer from the tip of my rod to the float, so it's loading up my rod a little bit more. And if you have some brush hanging overhead, like see if I wanted to do a normal cast, I wouldn't be able to because of this, but let's say that's a tree. If I have to stay lower, what I have to do is I have to create, my pendulum has to be lower because it's going to need, that's what loads my reel up. So but this is nice too because like I said, you're never going behind you. So if you have a bunch of brush or a big tall slate wall or something, or a bridge for example, this is a great cast for that. And this one, you're just, you're creating that same sort of pendulum and you just got to get your timing right. You take your two fingers, you come at the bottom of the reel, and then when you come back, you just take your finger off and then pull down and come forward. I'll do that again for you guys. All right, so I'm never coming behind me. It's kind of like when you're doing this, it's kind of like the same benefit to spade fishing where you're keeping the line in front of you the whole time. And then you're slowing the reel down right before you finish the cast. You're able to get a good 50 feet with that cast if you do it right. All right, now I'll show you guys the overhand Wallace cast. So that one is you're coming across your body, or I'm sorry, behind your shoulder this way. And that's a little bit more challenging because you don't have this whole entire motion to come across your body where the rod is moving from here all the way to here. You only have the motion coming from here to here. So you could still get really good distance with it. I mean, it helps to have a reel with a heavier spool because when the line is, when you pull down in your reel and it starts peeling the line out, the heavier spool helps a lot with that. So the overhand Wallace cast is pretty much the same way. I'm going to take my two fingers, come down. What you want to make sure is you don't come underneath the reel like this. I see a lot of guys, when they pick up a Centerpin, they always want to grab it and come underneath, which makes it really difficult to do. You take your two fingers and come down forward like this, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to pull it. So again, I got my pendulum here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back and load it and throw it forward. And then I'm going to slow it down with my finger right before it hits. So I'll do that again one more time. It's pretty much like 4 steps, okay? So your first step is to make sure you got enough line from the tip of your rod to your float, which is creating your pendulum. Your second step is to take your two fingers, go at the bottom of the reel. Your third step is to come back. And then your fourth step is to take your finger off the spool and come forward. So those are the 4 things you got to remember. And then once you have that, you can just pull down and slow it.
Does the force of which you're pulling back with your left arm or how far back it goes make any kind of a difference? I mean, I know it's going to increase the speed of the rotation of the reel, but does it allow you to cast farther, get
Yes.
more line off the reel quicker?
Yep, the harder you pull down, I mean, if you wail on it, it's kind of like golfing. There is a certain point where if you try to pull down too hard, you're going to lose some of that, but the faster or the harder you pull down, once you find that happy medium, the further it will go. So when I want to get more distance, I'm pulling harder down on my reel.
So it's a speed thing too. If you slow pull it or fast pull it, that has a difference as well?
Right. So if I'm trying to pick a spot that I want to hit, I'm pretty much with a 13-foot rod, and once I have my pendulum out there, 10-foot, I'm pretty much just finding a spot and placing it there a lot of times. And when I'm doing that, if I'm fishing a smaller to medium-sized creek, all I have to do is I just come back here, and I can just find the spot I want to be, and just kind of pick it, pull down slowly, and I can just aim wherever I want, and I can hit it on a dime. And that's what I like to do when I'm fishing smaller spots, or if I'm trying to get it in somewhere that's real tight. So
well,
if I'm
pulling
here,
it super hard and fast is not necessarily going to give you the most distance. I mean, there's a point of diminishing return, right?
Yes,
You can get
yes.
line falling off the reel.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, but it is, the harder you pull it down, the further it will go to a point. Once you get where you're pulling it down so hard, it's really hard to control the reel. So it's kind of a happy medium, and you got to learn your reel. All the reels kind of work a little bit differently. The way that I make my reels is I try to make a heavier spool, so you could, and I also try to put ceramic bearings in it, make the hub a little bit bigger where the bearings sit in, so I'm getting more feel when I'm casting. So that's where the feel and the feedback of the reel comes into play a lot.
And you start your pull at the point of which the pendulum is at its highest point towards you. Generally?
Yeah. So if I'm coming back, right now is where I'd start the pull right before it comes forward. So I'm here, starting to go forward. I pull down, and I just slow it down right there. And the whole time you can see my fingers are my first guide coming out to the rod. When you're looking for rods too, you know, one of the things I want to point out is you want to try to find a rod that has a nice high frame guide for your first guide, because these reels sit so far off the rod. Having a really high frame guide really aids in number one, being able to spread the weight out of the rod, and you're also making the smoothest transition from your reel to the first guide. So that's one thing you want to look for. The other thing in float rods that you really want to look for is you want to try to find a rod that has oversized top guides. Obviously, for ice reasons, the bigger the ring is, the less ice you're going to get. And the other reason too is that the bigger the guide, the less resistance you're going to have as the line is going through. It's just like surf fishing. The bigger the guides are, the further you're going to be able to cast, because there's less resistance as the line's going through the guides. There obviously is a point once you get past the size 8 guide, you start getting too much. The tip of your rod starts to become too whippy, and you start to lose the action in your rod. So I usually like to go no bigger than a size 8.
Is there a magic amount of distance that first guide should be from the tip of your grip? If you were shopping for float rods, do you want to look at, are some closer, some further away? Does that impact your casting ability? Or
the stripper guide doesn't make too big of a difference. It's all about, you know, when you're finding a rod, hopefully the manufacturer did a static guide test and they loaded the rod and they really saw where to place a guide, so they got the best parabolic curve possible. So a lot of times that's the most important thing. I have seen people add extra guides towards the bottom to create more of a bend at the bottom, so the rod will load more here in the bottom during a fight.
But not an impact on casting. So
no, nothing on casting. All right, and then the other cast I want to show you guys, it's going to be a little bit difficult since this is only a 7-gram float, is the BC cast. And the BC cast, it's nice because it's kind of just like casting a bait caster. You don't need to pull the line down. The reel is actually casting the presentation out there for you. This is all just about timing at this point. So basically a BC cast is you bring your rod back. Right before you come forward, you start the reel to spin like this, and you time it where when you come forward, you're slinging your rod so the float, you know, pulls the line out of your reel. So I'll show you that cast too. Like I said, I don't know what to expect right now with the lighter float, but I'll do my best for you guys. All right, so this is pretty much, you can do this either side, either coming back like this way or this way. I'll try to do it this side so you guys can see what happens. So again, I got my stopper finger, which is my ring finger. And on this cast, I always like to grip the bottom of the rod here to kind of give me more of a load. So once I'm here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back here. And then right before I come forward, sorry, Gary.
You're going to fight this chair or what?
It's a big one, it's 40 cover there.
try swinging it this way, yeah. More of a crossbody.
so then this one I'll do a crossbody version. Yeah, that's better. Alright, so I'm here, I take my finger off, and I come forward, and that's that cast. And that was just a reel spinning on its own. But this is one of those casts that you definitely need more room. You definitely need to be able to like come back here and load it, and then swing it like that to be able to get like the maximum amount of distance. It's hard to do it in this little room, but it's actually a big room. I don't realize how much room these casts take, but
Is it
so if I'm here,
Is it important to keep the butt of that rod on that cast like pinned to your side, your body, or tucked in tight? Or I see a lot of guys that keep it pinned to their elbow as they swing it, and I see other guys that like keep it right in like the side.
yeah, I mean, me personally, I like to just come back, take my finger off it, and once I get the right load. But it being such a light float, it's hard to really get it to go where I want it. But I'm here, that would have been a good cast. So again, guys, I'm just using my ring finger. I'm starting back here to take my finger off, so the reel starts on its own. So I'm back here, come forward, and that's your BC cast. You gotta just find a happy medium, because like I said, every reel is gonna have a little bit of a difference. And this is definitely better to do with like a 10 or 11 gram float.
But you need a lot of room.
Yeah, you do. You need a lot of room for this cast.
You see anything in like the length of a rod or the action of the rod or guide spacing or anything that impacts casting ability one way or the other?
Like I was saying, just the oversized guides, but being, Wallace casting, considering you're pulling down on the reel, which is going to give you your distance you need, the harder you pull down on your reel, the further it's going to go. It's really the reel's doing the casting for you and not your rod. So I don't really notice much as far as rod length or anything like that. I know with side casting, a whippier rod tends to be a little bit better, because when you're side casting, you're here and you're pretty much loading the rod up, and the rod is kind of like working as a slingshot to cast it for you. So a slower to medium action tip is going to help, almost like a slingshot, load that up for you.
How about reel positioning? I know a lot of it is comfort, but what about casting ability, positioning the reel high?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you go to purchase a float rod, you're going to notice most of them come with sliding rings, and there's a few manufacturers that make them with a reel seat. Obviously, if you're spending the money to buy a really nice reel, you want to be able to put it in a reel seat so there's no play. But because everybody's arm's a little bit different of a length, the sliding rings seem to be the most popular thing when you buy a factory rod, because then you could dial it in. Me personally, I like to have it right to the back of my elbow, so I'm gaining the best leverage while fighting a fish. And then also when I'm casting, it's not getting in the way of me. So if I'm coming back and across, if that handle was longer, it'd be hitting my waders or my jacket. And if I'm here, going to cast down, as this rod butt is coming from here to here, it's likely to hook, into my jacket or my wader straps. Now I know there is guys who, when they cast, they keep it down here, and they can cast it like that, which is great to be able to do. But like for me, that's not how I do it. And I know some guys, when they fight fish, they like to tuck the rod under their armpit while they're fighting a fish, and that kind of helps them with leverage during a fight, But overall, I don't think you need to go past your elbow. But there are a lot of guys who like to have it tucked in their armpit or putting it against their waist, which will help them during the fight of a fish, or help them during casting, I guess it's just all personal preference, so right?
If you're doing if you're more of an overhead casting guy, is it probably better to have like a longer foregrip or have your reel positioned further back? Whereas if you're a crossbody caster, you're fine putting that reel further forward so you get more of that butt behind you when you are fighting fish, or?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the thing you'll see a lot of is the guys in Canada and BC, they have a much shorter butt here. It almost looks like a spay rod setup and a much further foregrip. And the reasoning for that is when they fight the fish, number one, they like to have that extra cork there so they can kind of steer the fish and get better leverage. And I mean, it does really beat your wrist up when you only have 6 inches back there. I mean, it's like fighting a big fish on a fly rod. It's really challenging. It beats your wrist up good. But they like that because they're mostly BC casting. They just need enough handle for when they grab onto that, they're loading that rod and they're just using that little bit of handle just to be able to cast it out there. But and then you'll see, you know, I did a recent post on one of the blogs asking guys what they liked, and I saw a lot of guys like, you know, that 13 to 15 inch rear grip, which, you know, I kind of have to see personally. I haven't seen why that's effective, but for me, if I can't travel with my rod all around my body, it doesn't make sense for me. Like if I had a longer grip there, it would be difficult. I guess if you got good at keeping the rod past your armpit and you just kind of use that to cast, I mean that would be okay. Like I just did that there, and then you can use it for, you know, when you're fighting a fish, I guess you could keep it out here and you know, just reel like that and keep it against your body, which I end up doing with this a lot of times when I'm fighting fish, is keeping it against my body. Is that good for anyone? Want to see a specific cast again, or do you have any questions before I move on to something else? You guys good? Cover it pretty good, Greg, or something else? Okay. All right. Anything you guys want to talk about next? Any questions you have? You got me right now. I can tell you anything you want to know. Any questions when you're out there, you're not sure about something? Shotting patterns?
So you're going to the Niagara tomorrow. What are some of your go-to lures you're going to use or like setup?
Okay, so at the Niagara, because the Niagara is kind of a special place, and because the falls are there, and plus because it feeds in Lake Ontario, number one, it gets a really huge smelt run. So there's tons of smelt running up it. Number two, there's a lot of emerald shiners that get washed over the dam that don't survive. So a lot of times when you see the birds all flying over the Niagara all winter long, all they're doing is just picking off all those dead smelt and all the dead emerald shiners. So you're pretty much, when I go down there, I'm looking for something that's going to imitate like a big flashy dead bait fish. That's what I'm trying to do. So my top bait choices are really long Marabou Jigs. If you can get an articulated Marabou Jig, that's probably my favorite. I like big white with a lot of flash is really good. And then the other thing I like too is you know, any sort of egg presentation. So I'm sorry, let me get back to bait fish. There's also a whole entire bunch of rubber baits that I really like to use. Like you know, you can find pearlescent rubber worms and put them on a minnow jig head, works really well. Gulp makes a bunch of really good baits that are like minnow shaped baits. There's another brand called Lunker Hunt, and they make some really nice soft plastic baits with like a Kevlar inside. So once you put the jig head in there, the Kevlar kind of locks the jig head in, and plus that Kevlar gives it flash in the center. So those are really nice too, and then you don't go through a ton of them. The problem with running any sort of like big, like large white presentation is it's tough to keep the lake trout off. So when you're steelhead fishing, it gets pretty frustrating all the time because you throw something out there and you know, you get a lake, your bobber goes down, you set the hook, and it's a lake trout. And you can sit there all day and catch them. And some guys, that's great, you know, lake trout are fun, but when you're down there targeting steelhead, you know, it gets frustrating. So I tend to start looking for baits that steelhead will react to better than lake trout. And one of those things are, you know, row bags and beads and some different like pink jigs and pink worms. I'm trying to think of what else is something. You know, the other thing too, if you're up for it, you can take a bucket of minnows down there. Minnows get really difficult to cast. I saw a product out there though. It's pretty neat. It's like a little button that goes on the hook. So if you hooked a minnow through the eyes, you can put one of those buttons on both sides, and that keeps that minnow in place pretty good for you. But you really can't beat a minnow on the lower Niagara. There's so much bait in there that minnows is going to be one of your best baits. Problem is, again, you know, the lake trout in there. But you know, this for steelhead, I like, you know, a variety of Marabou jigs. I like, one of my favorite one is, I call it the Niagara Freak Show. It's blue Marabou and pink Marabou for a tail, a purple body, and then a pink jig head. That's probably one of my favorite jigs down there. And then straight purple jigs are great. And then I like the, my favorite color row bags and beads are going to be real bright pinks, and like salmony orange colors are really good too. So the other thing too, when you're going down the Niagara, a lot of guys like to use a slip float rig because they can't cast a 15-foot long leader. So you know, if you go down there, you may want to rig up slightly differently. And how I would rig up for that, if I was going down there, is I would what I would do is I would actually use 2 bobber stops. I would use bobber stops below the slip float and above the slip float, so you have that option if you wanted to make it a fixed float at any time. But then if you needed to, you know, put all your presentation in 4 foot because you're really trying to hit a far cast, you certainly can do that. So, so I would say a slip float for someone that's entry level is going to be your better choice.
You talk about soft beads, hard beads, when and where, switching sizes, maybe switching hooks with beads, and
Absolutely. Okay, so you know, one of the big crazes in float fishing is beads, and beads are super duper effective. They're imitating an egg, you know, a steelhead or salmon or brown trout egg, and you know, kind of depending on where you fish will depend on the color, the size, and what type of water you're fishing is going to depend on what material you use. Okay, so there's glass beads, there's acrylic beads, there's styrene beads, and there's mixes of styrene and acrylic beads also, and then there's, you know, a soft plastic bead. What I like to, when I'm looking for beads, the thing I'm looking for is I want to match the bead to the same sinking, the same sink rate as a natural salmon egg. So if you drop a soft bead in the water, you want that thing to sink. It's very important that that does if you're running the same sort of presentation. There's a lot of soft plastic manufacturers. It's cheaper to make a less durable, buoyant egg. It's cheaper to do that. And you know, a lot of these guys who sell these packs of beads, that's what you're getting. There's Death Row, and then there's Steelhead Stalkers. They both make a sinking soft plastic bead, and that's probably my favorite bead right now. And the benefit to fishing a soft plastic bead over a hard plastic bead is you're able to change the bead without cutting your leader and line and putting a different bead on every time. And the other benefit to a soft plastic bead is when a fish grabs it, they don't spit it out as quick because there's some sponginess to it, where when they grab a hard bead, they're spitting it out. The amount of time that they hold on to it is a lot shorter. So soft plastics will outperform a hard plastic bait all day. I mean, I know there's a lot of information out there about how long bass hold on to a soft plastic versus a hard plastic, and it applies the same to steelhead as well. And so if I'm going to, I don't know why this is, I'm not too sure, except the water clarity and the strains of steelhead. But the thing I've definitely noticed is when I'm fishing Lake Ontario, the more yellows and chartreuses and greens seem to work a lot better than when you go to Erie. I mean, you certainly can catch the same, you know, you certainly can catch steelhead on the same chartreuses and yellows and greens and stuff on the Erie tributaries, but in Lake Ontario, they seem to like it a heck of a lot more. When you go to the Erie tributaries, you definitely want to use more pinks, pinks, oranges, some different salmon shades, so they're like a pinkish peach color. Those work really well, and then you can get into using some of those dead egg colors as well, which work really good. Those same dead egg colors also work really well on the Ontario tributaries, just because there's so many dead salmon and brown trout, which we're not getting on the Erie tributaries. So that brings me to another point. Because there are so many salmon in Lake Ontario and brown trout, you want to definitely try to match the hatch as best as you can. So when the salmon are in, I typically like to run an 8mm bead, And when the brown trout are spawning, I typically like to go down. If you could find a 6mm soft plastic bead, that's great. If not, Death Row makes like a 7mm one that's really good. I like fishing those a lot. And you're like I said, you're just trying to match the hatch. You want to, you would think you would want to run a 10mm bead when you're fishing in Lake Ontario tributaries because it's a bigger bead. But the beads they push water differently, and when they're seeing a 8mm egg coming down all the time, they're kind of zoned in on how much water, that cup shape of the way that egg is pushing. So they're really seeing that and they're honing in on it. So you'll be able to pick up an extra couple fish by going to a smaller bead. And I can tell you, I've been to Bird Dam before or Oak Orchard where the fish are getting really pressured. And I'll go down to a 6mm bead, like a brown trout size, egg bead, and that's all they want. They won't touch an 8mm, they won't touch a 10. That's what they want is a 6mm. So that makes a really big difference. When I'm fishing Erie tributaries with soft beads or any beads in general, I like to run 10mm beads. And the reason I like to run the 10mm beads is because they're not really seeing any eggs whatsoever. So you're getting the fish's attention more by giving them a bigger presentation. So I like the 10mm beads when I'm fishing the Erie tributaries. And then in the springtime when the suckers are spawning, that's when I start liking to switch over to some of those yellow colors I was using on the Ontario tributaries during the fall time. Some of the other baits that I really like to use, I like to use the same kind of stuff that I was talking about. I use in the Niagara. There's some really good soft plastics. There's some blade baits I like, which is just a regular little Colorado leaf with a single sea wash hook behind it. And then I like to run the Marabou Jigs are great. And then my favorite bait is natural eggs for sure. Salmon eggs are by far my favorite over anything else.
Hey Dan, when you run those soft beads, how far from the hook is that bead?
Well, the maximum you're allowed to put it is 2 inches. I found my sweet spot personally is I like it about 1 inch away. That's where I get the best hookup to land ratio is about 1 inch. So everybody's a little bit different. I've seen guys, they like them further away, but that inch is, when that float goes down, instead of setting the hook really hard, I like to just kind of just lift up and let that hook come up and get them. It's if you pull it out if you set your hook too fast when your float goes down, the hook misses them or skims them a lot of times. So setting it slower helps that hook kind of find its point and then bury in. And when it comes to types of hooks I like a straight eye wide gap hook for bead fishing. And when it comes to running eggs or anything like that, I like to run there's a hook called the Skeena hook, and it's basically that it's got like a straight shank and it's got a wider gap, but that where the gap is, the hook is actually 45 degrees offset, and then the eye comes out just slightly. It's almost like you can't even see it, but those hooks are definitely fish best snelled because of the direction that the hook is, the direction that the hook sits on the leader. So if you don't snell one of those hooks, when you set the hook, a lot of times the angle of the hook will cause you to miss the fish. So if you have a hook with an outward eye, I really like to snell it. And if you snell the hook too, and you use some sort of egg loop knot, you could also add extra stuff into it. Like you could put a little piece of yarn onto it. You could put a different color netting for some contrast, which helps a lot too. I always like when I'm tying my egg sacks, I always like to put extra little chunks of netting in there. Like if I tie 6 chartreuse sacks, what I like to do is take that chartreuse, and when I'm tying my next batch of pink egg sacks, I like to trim up all the little sections, all little dusts of chartreuse to put into the sack, so you're getting a contrast, just in case the pink doesn't catch their attention.
What about hook sizes? When do you make a decision and why? Not necessarily related to beads, but I mean that's part of it too. Why would you make a move from a 10 to a 12? Is it always just fishing pressure, or would you always want to try to get away with the biggest hook you can get away with, or the smallest hook you can get away with? What goes into making that decision?
Okay, so when I'm deciding on what size hook I'm going to use, well, let me tell you what I have in my box. When I'm steelhead fishing, I have everything from a size 6 to a size 14. And that's for a variety of different reasons. From when I'm going to either run a single egg, I'll run a 14, or like a single wax worm, I'll run a size 14. And then if I'm running a really big roe bag or like a size 12 millimeter bead, I'll go up to a size 6 hook. The rule of thumb with beads, like the good bead fishermen I know, they say that the bead should fit into the hook gap. I find that is a problem because once you get to a certain size hook, you start to really dampen the action of your presentation. The heavier the hook is, the more straight up and down and the more your bait's getting weighted down. The smaller your hook is, the more your bait's moving around under the water. So pretty much I just like to match the bait size with, the hook size with the size bait I'm using. And I'd say a good rule of thumb, you can get away with a little bit smaller of a hook when you're running the soft beads because they're more squishy, there's more give to them. But when you're running hard beads, you want to definitely run a bigger bead because when that bead slides down and butts up against the knot there, it creates a wedge where a lot of times that fish can shake that hook and pop off. So typically I would say for a size 10 millimeter bead, I like to run a 6 or an 8, and for an 8 millimeter bead, I like to run an 8 or a 10 if we're talking soft plastics. And that's me personally. I've seen guys run smaller ones and I've seen guys run bigger ones as well.
So it's more about matching the hook with the presentation and how it impacts it rather than the water's really clear and I gotta use a small hook, or the water's really dirty, I can run a number 4 kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm learning new stuff all the time being out in the water, and I had a scenario this year where the water was perfect. There was 2 foot of visibility. It was green. I had roe bags that were about nickel size, and I had a size 12 hook tied onto my line from like the trip prior. So I got down there and, because I fish all the time, I'm lucky. I was pretty lazy. I didn't change my hook out or anything. So I left that size 12 on, and I'm drifting and I'm hooking fish, like a lot of fish left and right. And the fishing was so good, I'm like, well, I'm going to end up going to a size 10 because since the fishing's so good, I might as well go with a bigger hook. And, having a nickel size sack, a size 10 hook is still small for that size bait. So I switched to a size 10, and then that changed the actual action of my bait where I started getting less bites. So that changed the whole entire thing. So hook size is another one of those tiny little things that if you pay attention to, it can pay off real big for you. So if I'm not getting bites and I think I should be, I always scale back on hooks and then I scale back on fluorocarbon. And fluorocarbon is the same thing, right? Like the lighter you go with fluorocarbon, the more action your bait is going to have. It's not as stiff. So, guys ask me all the time, they're like, well, if fluorocarbon's invisible, can't I just run as heavy as I could get away with without breaking my main line? And I'm like, you can, but you're dampening the action of your bait by using a heavier fluorocarbon. The heavier the fluorocarbon is, the stiffer it's going to be, and the less natural your bait's going to move around under the water. Anything else? Any other questions you guys have?
Go ahead.
Do you ever use styrofoam beads with your egg sacs?
I don't. I know a lot of people who do, and that goes back to just knowing your pattern. Now, if I was going to bottom bounce, I would love styrofoam eggs, or the little styrofoam beads and the egg sacs, because when you're bottom bouncing, what's happening is your sinker's at the bottom, and then your egg sac's later than your sinker, so your egg sac's kind of leading the way. So as you're bouncing it on the bottom, having that styrofoam in there is keeping it up and keeping it, presenting it to the fish first before they see the sinker and the 3-way swivel.
Do you ever bottom bounce?
Yeah, I bottom bounce sometimes. Not a ton though, because I'm in this industry, so I like to fly fish a lot too, but I'm constantly testing new products and trying new rods, so it doesn't give me a lot of time to do much else besides float fishing. But there definitely is a time and a place for bottom bouncing, and you could actually bottom bounce still using a float. Like I've actually been in situations that let me answer your question before I tell you about the shotting pattern. I've seen people before where, the way they fish is that they're float fishing just like I do, but that styrofoam bead inside their egg sac is giving them more of a lead in front of the rest of their stuff. So they're going to shot differently to account for that styrofoam bead that's helping that. egg sac float a little bit more. And they were catching just as many fish as I was doing that, but you have to visualize what your bait's doing under the water. And I say it all the time when I do seminars, it's the most important thing to do is to visualize what your bait is doing. You always want your bait to be in front of the rest of your presentation and that leading the way first, and you're controlling what your bait's doing by, touching your reel or or just slow or checking your float or stopping your reel or anything like that. So, if you're rigged for it and you know what your bait's going to do, then it will be effective. So one of the things I wanted to say too is, talking about bottom bouncing is you certainly can do it with bottom bounce while still float fishing. And I've done that where I've used actually a quick fish on the end of my line. And what I'll typically do is I'll bring all my split shot just above my barrel swivel, and I'll leave just a little bit of split shot right underneath my float, so I'm able to load and I don't get too much of that boomerang effect where I cast, I have a heavy point here and a heavy point there, and they like to wrap around each other. But when I'm using a quick fish, what I like to do a lot is, I bulk shot all my shot right at the head of my swivel. I tie the quick fish here. That goes down and hits the bottom, and a quick fish is just sitting there working. And then I'm pretty much what I'm doing is I'm just trotting the quick fish down as it's going. And I'm talking real small quick fish, like they're the ones that are like this big. I don't know the sizes, but I think they're like a 4 or a 3 or something like that. They're real tiny, but they're really effective, especially when there's a lot of angry male. There's a lot of kiked up males around reds and stuff like that. Any little sporadic moving fish like that, they just want to kill to keep them away from the beds where they're spawning. The other time that I like to use this is a good scenario to use that rig is if you're fishing a waterfall where there's a lot of that upwelling and stuff like that, or if there's a turbine coming out. So if there's a turbine coming out and I'm able to get close enough to that turbine, what I always like to do is I like to take my float and I like to just drop my rig right in front of the turbine, and I let that weight cut down and settle right there in front of that turbine. And once I know my weight settled down, then what I do is I just slowly start trotting it down very, very slow. Like I'm holding back on my float the whole time, but I know that weight is sitting on the bottom, and I just let it kind of creep back little by little. And I'll actually lift my float up, let it drift down a little bit more, and that weight is just creeping down. And if you guys have ever fished a turbine at Bird Dam, that's a perfect example. You stand by the wall, you drop that weight in, the turbine wants to push it out right away, and if you just hold it there, the weight cuts down at the bottom and it just sits there. And that's usually when the water's low and clear, all the fish are piled up at those turbines. So you can use that for everywhere that has a situation like that. And then if you're fishing a waterfall, you have a lot of those upwellings. It's the same kind of thing, the upwellings of all that current spilling down and coming up is if you drop your egg sac down there with a normal shot pattern, what ends up happening is you just see your egg sac just kind of floating around with the current. And what I like to do with that is I like to bulk shot where I go 3 real big heavy shot, then two heavy shot, and then I just taper it right down from heaviest to lightest. So ideally, I'm doing that same type of taper from my float all the way down, except it's in a much shorter area like this. And I always keep a couple small little size 4 or size 6 split shots right on my leader. And then in that scenario is what I'll do is I'll slide my split shots right down next to my bait, and that really keeps it down there. And I can't tell you how many times I've slid these split shots where they're a couple inches away from my bait, and boom, it was just enough to get my bait down in front of the fish.
What's your progression as you approach a stream? I mean, you've got all these different choices like Marabou Jigs, egg sacs, beads, colors. How do you, time of day, et cetera, et cetera. What's your progression for how do you choose among that myriad of choices?
Okay, so what I really like in the Great Lakes, it's a lot different than the West Coast. So since we're just talking about the Great Lakes, I guess I'll go through that. But in general, if it's a West Coast or if it's the East Coast in the Great Lakes, steelhead are really, really aggressive biting fish. Like when they come in, they just want to bite right away. And how I decide what I'm going to throw at them is going to be how pressured they are. So when I first go down to a creek, right off the bat, I'm going to say, okay, well, I want to use a pink colored egg sac because I know that's what they like the most. But, you know, not only do I know that, but everybody else also knows that same thing too. So if I'm coming to a hole, and let's say it's 11 o'clock in the afternoon, 11 o'clock right before noon, and everybody's already hit the hole up, I'll try, you know, fishing my, you know, my egg sacs and see if my eggs are a little bit better than the other people's, or if maybe they just didn't have the right shade of pink, or if they didn't maybe trot their float the right way. And I'll see if I can pick up a couple fish like that. But if there's all really good fishermen there and the hole's really picked over, and I don't have another choice to go somewhere else, I'll start going through the different baits then. And I typically do a progression of different color egg sacs, then I end up going to Marabou Jigs, and then I'll start, you know, if I'm on the Ontario trips, that's when I start going to beads. I don't fish too much beads in the Erie trips unless I'm fishing like artificial only areas. So that's when I fish beads mostly. But yeah, it's pretty much how pressured the fish are. And I mean, the other thing too is the time of year is a big thing, because not only were the fish pressured that morning, but as soon as the fish enter the creek, they get pressured from the time they swim in till the time they swim out. So a lot of times when I'm fishing way up in the system on like the Cattaraugus, jigs will outfish eggs because they've already been caught on eggs all the way up through. So you go down there with like a soft plastic worm or something like that, and they'll end up taking that over egg sacs. So that's usually how I decide that.
Now, do you change colors as the day goes on? I mean, I've seen a lot of sort of talk about certain colors in the morning and then midday, different colors, and, you know, sort of going through a progression. Do you do
Yeah,
that?
I mean, there is, you know, steelhead see things in different types of water differently. You know, when the sun's at a certain area, they see things differently. I mean, I really just look for watercolor. Like, I think, you know, for Erie tribute, I should say for steelhead in general, like, they love the color pink. It is, like, ingrained into them that they love pink so much. So I would say pretty much when I go somewhere, I'm using pink or lighter shades, like hot bubblegum pink, and then I'm using lighter shades of pink. If that's not working, what I'll do is I'll start using like peaches and whites and stuff like that. And then what I'll do is, if I get in a situation where the water's like tannic colored or I'm fishing on slate, I'll end up running purple because purple shows up better on slate. And it's weird, you'd think a dark color purple egg sac wouldn't work good in dark colored tannic water, but it's actually the exact opposite. You want to run a darker colored bag in darker color water. And it's not dark like dirty, it's tannic, it's like stained tannic. It's really clear, but the water almost looks black. And that's when that purple netting or purple beads seems to really shine really well.
Dan, when you're switching between, say, eggs and jigs, are you re-rigging every time too? Because I don't believe you're shotting differently.
Yeah, so what I do is I pretty much always keep, like I was saying, I always have 2 small split shot on my leader at all times. And, you know, when I'm fishing slow water, I keep the split shot far away from my presentation. When I'm fishing faster water, I kind of put it towards the center. And those two really tiny little split shot, they make up for whatever jig size I'm using, right? So if I'm gonna go to a 64th ounce jig is what I run most of the time, all I have to do is slide off those 2 split shots, put a 64th ounce jig on, and then, you know, the jig will get down on its own. You really don't need any weight for it to get down there because it's a lead-headed jig. But when you're casting it out there, if you have a heavy spot right below your float and a heavy spot right at the bottom of your presentation at the bottom of your fluorocarbon, you get a boomerang effect. So as you cast it, a lot of times that weight wants to find the other weight and wrap around the top of the float. So what I always do is when I'm fishing jigs is I put the majority of the weight underneath the float, and then I still spread the split shot all the way down to my barrel swivel. But I'm just doing it it's basically like a much slower taper of weight. So like that would be how I'd fish a jig. It would be a lot of smaller little shots going all the way down, versus if I was fishing, that would be exactly how I'd run a jig minus these two little split shots on the leader. And then if I'm fishing eggs or something like that in the same sort of current, what I would do is I would, you know, space this out a lot more, where I'd put more of these heavy sinkers down closer.
Are you fishing similar depth, like if you're fishing the same depth of water, is your jig, are you running your jig as deep as you run your eggs, or do you generally?
Yeah,
run
because-
it shorter because of?
No, I could be a 60. Like I don't like running anything over a 32nd ounce jig, because when I hold back on that, number one, nothing in the creek, unless someone throws a rock in, is hitting the water and sinking to the bottom really quick. If you throw a 16th ounce jig in there, it's going to hit the water and just go zoom right down, unless there's a ton of material on that jig. So what I like to do is I like to tie up 64th ounce jigs, and I like to put a decent amount of material on them, so they're going to trot the same way and sit in the same way that a egg sac would sit or a bead would sit. So I want that jig, when I cast it, I want it to sink real slow, and then when I jig it, I want it to come way up. Okay, so I typically will I'll cast my jig out there. I'll pretty much jig it like slowly into the seam that I want to hit. And once I pick up the seam, I'm going to drift it pretty much the same way that I'm going to drift my row bag, and then just trot it.
So what is that jig doing under the water in terms of, at the bottom of the creek, right? You're not bouncing off the bottom.
No, it's doing the same. I mean, it's kind of, you know, if my floats, the current's going this way, what's happening is my floats, you know, I'm holding back on my float, and my jig's just facing me. My jig's just doing this the whole time as it's going down. And then I'll pause it, the jig will come up, you know, as my float's angled up, the jig will come up like this. I could twitch it a few times to make it look like it's trying to go up current. Slowly let my reel start spinning, drop the jig back down like this, and now it's just the action of the jig going down. And then I could, you know, stop it, stall it, let it raise a little bit, and then let it start going again.
Can we go back to slip floats for a second? What type of bobber stock are you using? What are you tying it up with? Are you using a braid or using a manufacturer's bobber stop?
Yeah, like ideally, me personally, my favorite bobber stop is the, there's a bunch of different companies that make plastic bobber stops, like little soft plastic bobber stops. Those are my favorite. It's the one with the little wire that runs through them that you just slide the bobber stop off on. The first one that comes to mind is Drennan. I mean, I really like the Drennan medium-sized bobber stops. They're a beige color. I always like to run 2 of them above the float, and then you want to run a bead right below that, so it doesn't get stuck on your float, because they're small enough depending on what type of slip float you're running. If you don't have that bead there, that bead will go up and get stuck inside that little tiny bobber stop. And then I like to run a bead right below the float, and then another bobber stop below that. So my favorite is Drennan with the bead, you know, like a little 4mm bead.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what would be big enough to stop the float from going up too high, but small enough to go through the guide of the rod.
Well, the beads never go through
Yeah, the
the
bead
guides,
ones.
because it just sits on top of the float the whole time. So
Okay.
it's just the bobber stops are the only thing that's going through the rod. And those Drennan ones are nice because they're so sleek and small, they just fly through the guides no problem. So those are definitely the ones I like the most.
Okay. And what size, like for the lower Niagara, what size jig would you use there? You wouldn't use your 64th ounce jig?
No, I would use a 64th
Yeah,
ounce,
so-
or up there I'd go up to a 32nd ounce. What I find myself doing also is, I know I said I would never use a 16th of an ounce jig, but you got to remember, the more material you put on a jig, the slower it's going to sink, because it's just more buoyant. It's just, that's the way feathers are. The more material that's on it, the slower it's going to sink. So you could actually make a 16th of an ounce jig sink just like a 32nd ounce by adding a ton of feathers to it. So I typically can't find the size hook I want for the type of pattern I'm going to run in a 32nd ounce. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll run a 16th ounce jig, but I'll just put tons of flash and tons of feathers and a lot more marabou, So it takes a lot longer for that marabou to sink, and it pulsates a lot more, and it moves a lot more water. So, anything else? Oh yeah, so yeah, I want to show you guys too. Everything I suggest here. So if you're not familiar with it, the best line right now in the market is a Blood Run floating mono. There's a high vis, which comes in orange, chartreuse, pink. There's a blue, which is kind of on that verge of being low vis. That's the line I like to run if I'm not running clear. Then you got your low vis, which comes in olive or clear. These are both floating monos, and what you're going to realize when you're out there fishing, it helps a lot to be able to lift your line up and mend over and work different current seams by running floating line. And I'm the type of person that when I'm drifting my float, I'm using back currents and eddies to get my float cocked up river when I can't do it with my own rod. So meaning if I'm fishing a seam that's out in front of me and I have to stay straight against that float to be able to get it to do what I want to do. But what's happening is when I'm putting pressure on it, so I'm trotting that float towards me, it's gradually, because I'm putting pressure on it, it's gradually starting to pull back into me. So what I do in that situation is I try to reach the opposite side of where that current is and let the slack water on the other side hold my float back for me. So the whole time what I'm doing is I'm keeping my rod tip kind of close to the river, and I'm allowing a bow to happen in my line, which is holding my float back the whole entire time, that bow. So what I do is, that line is just sitting on top of the water floating, so if my bobber goes down, all I got to do is lift it up and set the hook. I don't let the bow get like really out of control at all, and if it does get out of control, all I do is lift it up and just restart it, and then come back over and start a smaller bow in the back eddy channel. But some guys like the low vis, some guys like the high vis. I kind of find, me personally, if you're using a long enough piece of fluorocarbon, you could get away with using high vis line. But you know, there are those situations in a really slow deep hole, or a mouth of a creek, or a harbor or something, where you're fishing relatively slack water and the fish are coming in and they're schooling around chasing bait. And in that scenario, the high vis will hurt you. So if there's one scenario that I'm going to get hurt with a certain color line, I'm not gonna run a high vis line. So I like to stick to the blues and the olives and the clear. But you know, the high vis is nice because it does help you see when you're rigging everything up. If you're on the creek rigging, it's a lot easier to see an orange or a chartreuse line. And if you're fishing around a lot of people, it will certainly help you a lot too if you're shoulder to shoulder to see which line is yours when everybody's drifting, and other people to see your line a lot of times. So I know really good fishermen that all they do is fish low vis line, but if they're going to go to Burke Dam or Oak Orchard, they want other people to be able to see where their drift is. So they're going to run the high vis regardless. And then the leader that I suggest, you want to try to find a leader that is going to be abrasion resistance enough that when you hook a fish, it doesn't rub against something and break you off, and that you're not retying every single time you land a fish. But you don't want to find something that's so stiff that your bait has really bad presentation. So you want to try to find that happy medium. I tried Seagar STS, which you get 100 yards for like $10, and I thought I would try that stuff. And after every single fish, I found myself changing my leader. It was like there was frayed up. And then when I went to the Drennan, what was happening was it was so stiff that my bait literally, I mean, that stuff's really made for swinging and flies, but my bait was literally straight up and down from my float. It wasn't moving around naturally at all. So I've been playing around with different fluorocarbons. Blood Run, they really listen to all their anglers. You know, if you have something to contribute, you let me know and I can let the company know. So they've come out with a really great high abrasion resistant fluorocarbon, but also something supple enough to give your bait a really good action too. So I'll pass this around, let you guys take a look at it.
On eggs for egg sacs.
Yes.
Talking to people in Ohio, they're using steelhead eggs, they're using brown trout eggs with a lot of success. I've talked to people around here, I don't hear anybody using steelhead eggs. And everybody seems to be using salmon eggs with success. And then alternately, there's all these new products like Pro Row and all that kind of stuff. And what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, so eggs for me is like I could go into it I could do a whole seminar on just eggs, but I'll tell you kind of my thoughts on it is salmon eggs have a bad rap because number one, it's the only egg that you are legally allowed to sell in New York State at a store. So when you go to a store and you buy eggs, they're going to be salmon eggs. And most shops and most big stores, they don't want to lose their profits from eggs. So what do? They dunk them in acid, and they basically turn that egg into a piece of plastic. Okay, so what these acid cures do is they cook the shell and they still make the egg translucent. All right, but what that does is it gives the egg no smell whatsoever, and it makes it really, really hard. So if a fish bites your egg sac, they can't break down through the eggs to get to the hook. But a lot of times you're not even getting the bites anyways to even get that far. So because salmon eggs are so readily available at stores, that's what a lot of anglers use, especially a lot of like weekend warriors and anglers that are not really super serious about fishing with eggs. They end up just going to the store and buying salmon eggs. And then they end up going down to a creek and they see a guy that's fishing with brown trout eggs and he's killing them, and they're like, oh, well, it's got to be the brown trout eggs. And it's not because it's the brown trout eggs, it's because he caught the fish himself, he took care of the eggs, he made sure the fish was bled out properly, not stressed out, the fish wasn't stressed out, and he cured them himself, and they're probably natural. So natural brown trout eggs are going to work better than an acid-cured salmon egg. However, if you take good salmon eggs, I think salmon eggs will outfish everything because salmon eggs have been in their biogenetics for 10,000 years. Steelhead have been eating salmon eggs. So salmon have been around for something like 12,000 years, and steelhead have been around for something like 10,000 years. And they've been swimming in the same areas together, spawning. So the steelhead are definitely, it's almost like one of those things that it's a smell that they recognize. So I think it works a lot better. I think when brown trout eggs work better, it's when they've been really pressured on salmon eggs possibly, is when it works better. But I've been testing it out for the past 5 years where I bring both of them with me, and the salmon eggs outproduce everything all the time. I've had brown trout eggs, steelhead eggs, the whole 9 yards. I took some brown trout eggs out west to Washington, Oregon with me, and I was catching more fish on beads than really nice brown trout egg sacs, because I just don't think they were recognizing that smell. And if you ever catch a brown trout and you smell what their eggs smell like, it almost smells like a baked good. It smells like pancakes or something. It's really a weird smell. It doesn't have that fishy, oily smell like salmon eggs do. So, and the other thing too is, when I'm looking for a good quality egg, I want an egg that is going to break really easily when the fish bites it. Like guys water harden their eggs all the time because it makes it easy to tie. But as soon as you dip those eggs in water, they start to create a shell to protect from the elements. So, as soon as that salmon, with the salmon or steelhead or whatever fish there is, what they do is they start digging their beds out, and as they start digging their beds out, they start sucking up a little bit of water to naturally harden that egg before it comes out and goes into that pile of gravel that they're digging out, because they're digging the gravel out, and as they're digging it out, they're spitting the eggs, and it's not the hole that the hole that they dug out that the eggs are in, it's that big gravel buildup behind where the hole is. That's where all the eggs are. So it's not like a nest situation where they're inside the cup. So when you water harden your egg right away, now what's happening is you got a really hard egg that when you tie it into a sack, it's easy for you because you can scoop 4 eggs, tie it real tight, you're good to go. But when a fish grabs that, it's really hard for them to bite through all those eggs and get down to the hook. And I miss a ton of fish. I can't tell you how many times I've hooked a fish, fought him for a couple of minutes, my hook comes out, I reel in, I got my egg sack's still good. It's like, what the heck, it looks beautiful. So, I always...
So it is better to keep them, because the ones I've cured have have been real sort of fragile.
Yeah,
And
that's
when
what you
I'm
want.
tying them up, you know, sometimes I'm crushing them just tying them.
Absolutely.
And having to restart. And I was thinking I need to make them harder, and you're saying no.
No, start up higher when you're tying your bags, start up higher on them and just work down where you're not touching, where you're not touching the eggs. Like when I tie my egg sacks, my netting is actually fairly loose. And then what I do is when I take an egg sack out of the container to hook it, what I do is I like work my way around the eggs, and then I turn the egg sack real slowly, and then I find another angle to hook it, and that tightens up my egg sack where I'm getting that nice round appearance now. But I like my eggs as soft as I can. If I get 5 or 6 drifts out of an egg sack and not get a bite, I'm ripping it off and putting a new one on. So I only want mine to go for 5 to 10 drifts, really, for my bags. And what I've noticed is brown trout eggs, they are like rocks. I even tried to scrape some brown trout skein this year, and the brown trout skein that I scraped, I thought, okay, well, I don't like brown trout eggs because they're too hard. Maybe if I try some that are immature, I will like those a little bit more. And I scraped them and tried them, and they were still super hard in the water. And I also got a heck of a lot less bites on those versus a salmon scrape. So my favorite egg is salmon eggs, and I like them before. You gotta try to find the fish before they start sucking water up and spitting the eggs out. Because if you get a fish and when you squeeze her, she squeezes a lot of water comes out, just a handful of eggs. The eggs look really good. They're usually they usually look like they have an embryo inside. They have a nice blood dot, but those eggs have already been water hard naturally inside the fish, and then they're no good for bags. So I'm not a big fan of those. But I like either salmon scrape is my favorite. It takes a little bit more work to go through and bleed the fish out and get all the membrane off. But that's going to be your best egg by far. Your second best egg is either going to be a salmon that hasn't started sucking up some water. And then my all-time favorite is coho eggs because they're the softest out of any salmon that we have here locally. I'm not too familiar with pink salmon eggs and chum salmon eggs. I've played with them, but I haven't played with them side by side with other eggs to really tell you which one was the softest. But coho by far is my favorite egg.
Now, when you bleed them, do you gill bleed them when you cut them?
I cut their gills and I cut their tail right off. Cut the whole tail off. And you will, when you cut their belly open to get the skeins out, you'll have no blood. You'll have a tiny little, like a vein or something, but it's no blood in the actual eggs. Because you got to remember, those eggs are like sponges, right? Because when they hit the water, they have to be a sponge so they could start sucking up water and create that shell so they could be around in the elements and not get damaged too much. So if you touch them with any sort of chemical or anything like that, or any blood, they're already going to start absorbing it. If it hits blood, that egg has blood in it, whether you can see it or not. It's not going to last as long, it's going to spoil quicker. Anything else? Oh, I want to tell you guys too. So I was showing you how I like to rig up, my float up here. And one of the cool things that I like to do, this is something I always share, it's really helpful, is I always like to run 3 pieces of tubing, okay? And you really guys say, well, why do you do that? You really only need 2, right? Because there's a top of the float and the bottom of the float. Well, after you take the time to put on this 11 grams of weight here, that's a lot of pinching and that's a lot of weight. You know how hard lead is to get in New York. So after I put all that on, you don't want to lose it. It's a real pain in the butt. So I always run 3 pieces of tubing. I run one at the top. I run the same size one that I put at the top, I run at the bottom at kind of the base of the float. And that is a backup one for my top one. And then I cut a long one that is going to hang at the bottom of my carbon or steel or bamboo so I don't get any rattling when it touches a float. Because what happens is, if you're snagged or you're fighting a fish, sometimes, not often, especially nowadays with the better tubing that's out on the market, your top tubing will rip and it's like, oh my god, I gotta re-rig everything or try to slip it past my split shot to try to get it on there. It's a real pain in the butt. So if you have that extra backup one there, you won't have to do that. You just slide off the long one, slide off that second short one and replace it. But that is where, when you get a snag or when you get a hot fish, that top one is the one that tears.
Blood Run just came out with this new tubing. It's like actually made for fishing. Most guys use surgical tubing or aquarium tubing, and the stuff it's junk. You stretch it way out, and it turns white. It doesn't come back to that normal, nice looking tube that it originally was. So this stuff's actually meant for fishing, so it doesn't tear real easy, and it's 2 different sizes. It holds pretty much all different stem floats. So it's the best stuff out right now that I found. So you can see if you took a piece of blackbird tubing and you stretched it, it would turn white, and it's also really hard, and it kind of damages your line. This stuff is nice and soft, and it's super durable, and it holds up good in the cold too. So that's one of the other products I really like. Another good product to keep your rods together is this rod huggers that we sell at the shop. They're really super cool because one of them has a little hook keeper at the bottom, so when you break your rod down, what ends up happening a lot of times is you reel it all the way to the tip, and then what happens is your hook, if it doesn't line up past your hook keeper, it usually comes up down below, and then you have to sit there and play around with it and adjust it. Where what's nice about these is you just slide up your rod hugger wherever you want it to be, and you just put it through this little hook keeper right here, and you're good to go. They're also nice too because they help you when you're guiding your float or your rod in and out of your car, or you're walking through the woods or something in low light conditions. It really helps out with that too. And if you drop one on the ground, they float real nice. It's a really good product. I don't have a hook on this one, so I'm trying to make do with this little bead stopper thing this guy gave me. Anything else you guys could think of while I'm here?
Yeah, so when you're going down to a creek, and how muddy is the water, like how low is, do you like say I can't fish this? Like if it's like less than 6 inches or just like pure chocolate milk, do you still fish it or?
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's like one of these things, I mean, I'm pretty spoiled. I own a fishing shop, and when the fishing's really good, I put a gone fishing sign on the front of my door and just go, so I'm pretty fortunate. But if it was like one of these things where I only got to fish once a month and I had to kind of make do with what's there, there's really, I mean, the Cattaraugus is an exception because that gets really dirty. But if I'm in an area where the water is moving slower, the fish have a long enough time to see the bait, I'm confident in fishing in 2 inches of visibility. There's spots on the Cattaraugus where that I know are better to fish when the water's high and muddy, and there would be like 2 inches of visibility. I just will have to pick the spots on where the fish are going to hold a little bit better, and where they have time to look at the bait, see the bait, and smell the bait. But that's when you want to start incorporating scent, and you want to start incorporating contrast, because fish they could see like the first color they could see is UV. The second color they could see is yellow, and before they could see any of those colors, they could see contrast first. So contrast is the first thing they could see. So when I'm fishing dirty water, what I always do is I always will tie like 2-tone egg sacs, or I'll take a piece of chartreuse netting and wrap it around my hook, and then put the egg sac on my hook. But unless it's raging really hard where there's no soft spots and there's zero visibility, then I won't bother. But I could always find an option at all times. Like if it was just a downpour and a melt off, and I had to go try to find something down in Erie like this weekend after everything is blown out, I should be able to find a creek to fish. Anything that flows into Lake Erie gets fish in it, or Lake Ontario. If it flows in there, a fish will try to run it. So you just have to find something that's clean enough to fish. And a lot of times, that's how I found a lot of my little secret creeks, is by, when everything's blown out, I've had to do a little walking around and find some smaller spots. But yeah, like I was saying before, like that day where I was catching those fish, actually I don't think I was telling the story, but I was at Burt Dam one day, and the water was chocolate milk. I mean, I got there, I put on an egg sac, and I was drifting. I wasn't catching anything. There was a guy catching a fish here, a guy catching a fish there, And my buddy Jimmy was just whacking them, you know, and I was like, what are you using? He's like, oh, an 8mm bead. And I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, that's amazing. An 8mm bead is working in this chocolate milk, right? So I said, well, let me get one of those. You know, it was a glow row bead, which glows in the dark, which is going to help out a little bit with the viz. But because the water was so chocolatey, I didn't really think it was going to matter much. So I put on that 8mm bead and I was drifting. And first drift, boom, I had a fish right away. Second drift, I had a fish right away. And then I ended up catching a rainbow, a steelhead, that when I brought him in, its whole entire throat was filled with, like, they looked like 8mm beads. It was just all these salmon eggs that were just washed up in that area they were feeding on. But if you had something too big like an egg sac, you'd think, oh, well, it's got a lot of scent, it's a big profile, they're probably going to bite that. No, they're honing in on those little tiny eggs that are just getting washed along the bottom. So you're in that situation, you're trying to match what's ever in the water, even in a dirty condition. And what I ended up finding out was where we were standing, there was a bunch, the water was up higher, so I didn't know it until I stepped there and I smelled it. But where we stepped, there was a bunch of dead salmon, and by us stepping there and stepping on the dead salmon, all the eggs were washing down the river. And now those fish were like, you know, it was like we were fishing for chum fish basically, and they were just eating that 8mm egg. But yeah, I mean, contrast is one of those things. I fished a tournament one year at the Cattaraugus, and it was like, you know, you already paid for the tournament, so you had to fish it when it was high and muddy. So what I did was I put on a size number 4 hook, I put on a pink egg sac and a chartreuse egg sac, and I found the slowest water possible. It was like 3 foot deep, but I just sat there, and it was against a wall. I just sat there and just fished against that wall, and eventually I hooked a fish, and it was only 8-pound fish, but no one else caught a fish that day. So I won it with an 8-pound fish. So yeah, I mean, you could catch them in any type of water. They're moving around, you bounce it off their nose, they'll hit it for sure. Anything else, guys? Any other questions? Did I miss anything, Greg? Is that about an hour? We're good. Cool. All right. Thank you guys so much for coming down.